Hello, my name is Lisa Mazzie, and I'm a professor of legal writing at Marquette University Law School in Milwaukee. And today I'm doing an oral history with Professor Karen Czapanskiy. And we'll start, Professor, with the beginning and just ask where you were born, when you were born, where you grew up. Let's talk about your early experiences.
Well, this interview is being filmed in Washington, D.C., and I am a native of Washington, D.C. Grew up on Connecticut Avenue, right off of Connecticut Avenue. Born in the late 40s, so I was one of the first group of women to enter law school when there were more than just a handful of us in the classroom at a time. And came from a family of a lot of lawyers. It turns out my father was a lawyer here in D.C. doing small private practice, not government lawyering. And he was in partnership with my uncle. I had a brother-in-law who was a lawyer, and it turns out some of my relatives from Ukraine ended up being lawyers and judges at some point in the Soviet times. So a lot of history of being a lawyer in the family.
A lot of lawyers in the family.
Yeah.
So did you have any siblings? You mentioned an in-law, so do you have a...
I have 3 siblings, 2 older sisters and a younger brother. And all of them at some point wanted to be lawyers, but I was the only one who actually went to law school. It seems to be a family occupation.
Okay. And did your mom work while you were growing up, or was she...
She had trained as a nurse in Baltimore. She came from Hagerstown. And that's how she and my dad met, was through a relative who was hospitalized in Baltimore. But after they married, he didn't want her to continue working. She was fine with that. I think she had some second doubts during the Second World War when they were heavily recruiting nurses, but she never went back to it.
Okay, so describe a little bit about what your childhood was like here back at that time, and you mentioned your siblings all wanted to be at some point, thought about being lawyers, but as a child, were you thinking about that kind of thing?
I don't think so. I was always told, hey, you know what, you should be a lawyer, you argue a lot, which was true. But I never really thought about being a lawyer particularly. The women lawyers who I could have met probably were heavily hidden. My father, for example, had an executive secretary who it turned out had been a lawyer. And when she retired in the 70s, I think, she actually did go and set up a private practice. But I had never known all those years that she was a lawyer. Years later, I was clerking for a judge who in Maryland had to stand for a retention election. And we would go around to various community events. And there was always some shy person, always a woman, who would come out from behind somewhere and pull my sleeve and say, you know, I'm a lawyer too. And so dozens of women went to law school, particularly in the Second World War. But they either never joined the bar, or they left the practice, or never went into practice. But they were there. And the percentage of women in my father's graduating class, he went to the predecessor school of what's now George Washington, was actually as high as the percentage of women in my graduating class.
Really?
And he graduated in the 30s.
Really?
So there was a period of time when there were a lot of women going to law school, but we only hear about a few of them here and there.
Right.
They didn't make as numerous a mark. They made a big mark, but not as numerous a mark on the profession as later groups did.
And that's interesting that the person that you did sort of know was your father's executive secretary, which actually was as educated as he was.
Exactly.
She was a lawyer.
In fact, she may well have been better educated because he went to a night school, and she came from a pretty privileged family in Montgomery County, and for all I know, she could have gone to a day school. But.
Right. So none of that was on your radar then. But as you, where did you go to school, Ronnie? Was it a public school, a private school? What was schooling
My
like?
siblings and I all went up Nebraska Avenue. We went to Murch Elementary, Deal Middle School, junior high back then, and Wilson High School, which back then, all 3 of them, were very much like private schools. The district committee made sure there were no people of color in any of our schools, long after Brown versus Board of Education, which was decided when I was in first grade, I think. And D.C. was one of the defendant school systems, but they decided on a practice of school assignment by residential neighborhood, and that meant white schools remained white, and the few elite black high schools, the one elite black high school in Washington at the time was of course integrated, so that it was no longer an elite high school.
Right.
But Wilson remained a white elite high school. We actually ended up benefiting from Dunbar's destruction because some of their teachers came to us. So I learned a little bit early on, a whole lot more later in my life, how privileged that set of three schools really was.
So you said you were in first grade or so when Brown was decided.
Yes.
Was that because you had lawyers in the family? Was there discussion about issues like that?
No.
Legal issues?
No, there was discussion about government, but not particularly about politics at that point, other than we had a lot of Southern relatives. And on our trips south to visit with them, which we did at least a couple of times a year, my siblings and I became very aware that their attitudes toward race were very different from ours. And so we must have been exposed to more liberal attitudes either by being in the school system we were in or through our family. I know that my grandparents, who had emigrated from Kiev to downtown D.C., my father's parents, were very proud of the fact that they had very good relationships with their neighbors, most of whom were black. And so I'm sure we got some of it through their sense that that's what you should do, that you should never feel like you're better than anybody else.
Right.
That was a big message from that part of the family.
Right.
And that part of the family, without my father's participation, was also very left-wing in terms of economic politics, socialists mostly.
So your father deviated a bit from that. So you said he went to a night school. Was he born in this country?
He was 7 when he got here.
Okay.
Didn't speak anything but Yiddish, a few words of Ukrainian, a little bit of Russian. But back then they would just throw them in the schools.
Right.
But he never really adopted my grandfather's economic politics.
Okay, so...
Much more conservative.
And then he was a lawyer, which probably helped a little that conservative stuff along if you're in private practice, I would imagine.
No, I think he actually chose to be a lawyer to distinguish himself from his father.
Okay.
His father didn't believe in education. That was something that you didn't need to do to be a good advocate for the people.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Which always surprised me a little bit because my grandfather was one of the best educated people I'd ever met. And my grandmother, who came here with, later than my grandfather, brought the 2 kids over, my father and an aunt, had to have learned to speak English in her mid-20s.
Wow.
And she could speak and read and write in English and Yiddish.
Wow.
Both my grandmothers could speak and read and write in several languages, actually.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah.
So as you were going through school then, you were talking about the schools that you went to were really good. Did you form any interests in what were your interests then as a young girl?
I danced a lot. I did Israeli dancing, studied several languages, Hebrew, Latin, French, loved that. Liked history a good bit, hated math. Mostly hated the math teachers, I think, even more than math. And wanted to be a horseback rider because I had a chance to do that in camp, never had a chance to do it anyplace else. Wanted to do ballet, never had a chance to do that. But I've gone back to the horseback riding since.
Oh, good.
As an adult.
Good. Yeah, we'll talk about that. So your sisters, you had 2 older sisters, so they were ahead of you. What were they up to, and did that affect sort of your thinking about where you wanted to go and what you wanted to do?
One sister was a good bit older. She was born in 1940, so she was 7 years older. And so her childhood was quite distinct from mine. And no, I never particularly wanted to follow in her footsteps for a lot of reasons. But she she was out of the house by the time I was in junior high. She was already in college. The next sister, my younger brother, and I are very close in age. My older sister, my younger brother have birthdays 36 months apart. So we were basically going through school, going through life, going through everything as triplets. And we felt that way about each other. We still to this day talk about how we have one brain that's just divided into three people, which my older sister really gets upset about because she gets to feeling left out for good reason.
Yeah.
So the three of us all went to Sunday school together. We all had a lot of the same friends. We went to Hebrew school together. We went, as I said, we went to all the bar mitzvahs here together in this hotel. And we just kind of fed off of each other a lot. My brother was very talented musically. My sister was very talented as a cheerleader. So I had to get the grades. There wasn't any path left open.
Okay. So you were the good student.
I was the brain.
Okay.
It turns out that we're all three equally, I think all four of us actually are equally smart, but that was not my role back then. Back then I had to get the A's.
Okay. And so you mentioned your older sister went to college. Was that, and that would have been in the mid-50s?
Late 50s,
Late
yeah.
50s
Yeah,
by then.
yeah.
Did you understand that you would be going to college? Was that a family expectation or a goal you set for yourself or both? Or?
It was a family expectation, and it was my father's way of saying that he really was a liberal, because the three daughters were going to get the same amount of money for college, which meant a full ride, as his son. The only distinction he would make is that if his son wanted to go to graduate school, he would finance that too, not the daughters. So, and the three daughters had to finish college with a teaching certificate so that we could have an occupation that was compatible with motherhood.
So was that was...
That was his way of being
okay, that was his, okay.
Yeah.
So what did you think about that as you were getting up, through high school and thinking about your future?
I thought that was about as dumb an idea as I could imagine. I liked the part about, he was going to pay for college. But the idea that I would be a teacher, I was never very good with little kids. And the idea that I would be a teacher, or that I would be married, or that I would have kids, none of that seemed particularly relevant. My two older sisters thought that was really very good ideas. They both wanted college, they both wanted teachers, they both wanted marriage, they both wanted families. And I think there's a kind of an interesting moment in time. My second sister graduated high school in '63. I graduated in '65. And I think those 2 years are a real fulcrum for a lot of women in my generation. That if I'd been older, maybe I would have, married the nice Jewish boys that both of them married. Maybe I would have had different goals, but they weren't right
Why
for
do you
me.
think? Why do you think that those couple of years?
Betty Friedan came out, and we had a chance to start putting words to things like why they won't hire us to deliver newspapers, and why we can't have a bar mitzvah, and why my father would send my brother to graduate school but not me.
Right.
We started to have a vocabulary, and we started to talk about it in high school. And actually, I learned about that book from a boyfriend whose mother had insisted that he read it.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So that was in high school?
That was in high school.
Wow. So when you say you talked about it in high school, was it actually part of like a class, or,
No.
or just the student you would just...
Somebody asked me the other day when I could start wearing pants to school. And I said, college?
That never occurred to me. So you did... Because there was a rule that you couldn't?
Not only that, but when skirts started to get shorter in the early, around 63, 64, and people were coming back from England with skirts that didn't quite cover your knees, we could not go to school without a skirt that did not, if you were kneeling on the floor, the skirt had to touch the floor.
My mom was educated in Catholic schools, and that's the story she tells, which I assumed would be different in a public school, but apparently not.
Not in a public school.
Wow. Okay, so then Betty Friedan came out, and then you were starting to put there was a language, a vocabulary you could use to think about your life experiences. And then did that change what you had already said you thought that maybe this idea of get a teaching credential was kind of a silly one.
Yeah.
But did you now start to think bigger, or
Well, the college aptitude tests baffled the counselors because they kept pointing me in the direction of engineering when I was failing math. They couldn't figure out what that was about, so they didn't know what to advise me. I didn't really know what was going on. But I'd grown up in D.C. reading the Washington Post, there were political people all around me. Lady Bird Johnson was actually the scout leader for one of my Girl Scout troops. Lucy Johnson was in my elementary school. We were surrounded by people like this. When the Kennedy years arrived, people swarmed into our neighborhood, and one of my classmates was Nancy Coffin, whose father later sat on the First Circuit in Boston.
Wow.
They're just incredible people to get to know and to be around. Glenn Seaborg's daughter was in my high school class, my elementary, junior high, and high school class. So politics and government were always a huge part of what I thought I'd be interested in. So when I went to college, I thought, all right, it's going to be political science. I know something around that world already, and I like it, and I'm interested in it. I'll do that.
Okay. So let's kind of go back to, so you went to college, obviously, and we'll get there. So when your dad was going to fund your education, which is really progressive,
Right.
did he, other than the teaching credentials, did you have restrictions on you can't go too far, you need to look at these places? It could be anywhere?
I ended up in California.
Okay, so tell me
that was
how
about as far away as I could get.
That's why you wanted to go there. Okay.
No, actually that, and it's Snowden, Wisconsin, which is my other big choice.
I know that. Yeah.
I hate cold weather. So I ended up at Berkeley for several reasons. One was that I kind of looked the part, and my French teacher thought I should definitely go to Berkeley. My hair was down to my waist. I wore red. I wore book bags. Clearly, I was in that part of the world. I didn't really know culturally what all of those symbols meant, but she did.
Yes.
And so she suggested that. And I was quite amenable to anything that would get me out of cold weather. And I arrived in Berkeley the year after the FSM, so I knew a little bit about Berkeley from that. And one of my high school, another kid who graduated from my high school was one of the FSM 4 who'd been on the plaza. So when I got there, I learned a whole lot very quickly about why this is the best place in the world to be right now.
Was there a culture shock for you?
Yeah, huge. But I was ready to reach out and do something different.
Okay, so tell me about college then. What were you involved in? Anything extracurricular, or what was you're in the spot
Yeah,
in the
definitely
time?
You betcha. It was mostly politics. What at that time you could get involved in civil rights work, which some people were involved with, but frankly not very many on campus, which was interesting. And I felt like I was pretty much stuck on campus. People were just beginning to start to demonstrate against the war. But there was a lot of work on campus to try to organize people to be ready to think about lefty ideas. And I got involved in that. So it turned out to be a student political party that I got involved with. And we did a lot of campaigning in the first couple of years. And I lived in a very conservative dormitory because that's what a knowledgeable Eastern freshman would do. And we ended up advertising that party all over the windows of that apartment, that apartment building, that dormitory building, which was great fun. So I got to meet a lot of my classmates just by going into their rooms and saying, "Can I put an S in your window?" The name of the thing was Slate. "Can I put an L in your window?" And we almost won some major goals. We won a whole lot of seats in the student legislature that year. So that was very exciting. And then the next year I moved to a co-op, which was a much more amenable way to live if you were a lefty. And we created a summer residential college as part of that. I helped spearhead some of that. And it was the first time Berkeley had a summer residential college, so that was pretty cool. And so third year and fourth year I wasn't quite as active on an organizational level, but I was still participating in demonstrations. And actually in my third year I wrote my junior thesis, which meant that I had to go into the basement of Wheeler library. It was Wheeler? Into the basement of the main library every day to read the microfiches that they had ordered for me. It was on the Kenyan Colonial Archive. They had ordered the entire archive for me to read. So I was in the basement reading through these illegible British archives. And then coming out in the late afternoon, the plaza would be filled with smoke. I'd participate in the demonstration for a while, run home, do some writing, come back the next morning, start it all over again. which was great. You know,
Yeah,
I finished the thesis.
And it sounds like you very much enjoyed where you were and what you were doing.
Yeah.
Were you thinking law school then, or?
No, I took the GREs. I ended up switching from political science to history.
Okay.
And actually African history, because one of the most influential people I'd ever met was a professor in my African history class in first year, and he was brilliant, and he encouraged me a lot. He supervised this junior thesis that I did on Kenya, and then at the beginning of my senior year, I took the GREs, and I called Martin and I said, "Here's what I got," and it was low 700s, and he said, "You can get 800." I said, "No."
And Martin is the
Martin Klein.
Okay.
He's the professor, and I said, "No." He said, "I'm sorry, Karen, I can't get you in anywhere. They're not accepting women, even women like you, without an 800.
Wow.
So I said, "What do you think I should do?" He said, "Try law school." Because he knew my family he'd met my mom and dad. By that time, he knew my family were lawyers. And I thought, oh, okay. So I went and took, before the end of the year, I took the LSAT. I was going to take a year off. I applied to to Bolt Hall, got in, and almost went. So
okay, so why? Okay, so what were you going to do on your year off before the almost went? Or maybe that's all part of the almost went story.
Yeah, it is actually. It turns out to be part of the almost went story. I had a few dollars in the bank, so I went to Europe, did the traditional post-college backpacking trip, and ended up with an opportunity to go to Leningrad for a weekend. So I took it and had the borscht at the hotel and promptly got incredibly sick. This was like after 3 or 4 months of traveling, so I ended up coming home. And home was here. My folks had an apartment on Connecticut Avenue at that point, and I had to work to raise money for law school, which was going to start in a few months in California. So I went on the Hill and got a job reading the mail for Senator Cranston. I was literally in charge of his mailroom. He was the California senator at the time. And my colleague in the mailroom introduced me on a blind date to the man I'm about to have been married to for almost 50 years.
Oh, wow.
We'll be
Okay.
married. Well, our 50th is in a year and a half.
Oh, okay.
And he was coming to Washington he was actually heading to Europe from New York, and I was heading to California, and we decided a decent compromise was going to be Washington. So I applied on the last day possible to Georgetown, and he applied on the last day possible for a teaching job at AU, and we both got them. So we were stuck.
So almost Berkeley, but in the end,
Georgetown. Yeah.
Not a bad place to go there.
Yeah.
So
and they put everybody, they put me on the waiting list. I found out I wasn't going to California 2 days before the car had to leave for California. And it turned out that they'd gone to the waiting list because they had typically enrolled 3 first-year sections of 125 each. This is 1970, so we're in the middle of the draft, and a bunch more applicants accepted them than they had expected. So they ended up with a few too many for 3 sections, but not enough for 4. So they went to the waiting list. And lo and behold, they had put all of the most qualified women that they had taken 3 or 4. They had put all the rest of us on the wait list.
Right.
So 1 through 120 on the wait list were all women.
wow.
And we came into the law school, it was the first time they'd ever had more than a handful.
So not quite half, though. Not half.
Oh gosh, no, we weren't even a third,
Right.
but we were there.
Right.
And we were a lot more than a half a dozen.
And how was that? So was that the first time, at least, that you know of that there were that many women in a law school class at Georgetown?
Absolutely, it was.
And
Yeah.
how did that?
Yeah.
Did that affect the education?
Oh yeah, lots
Tell me
of
about
different
that.
ways.
Yeah.
Lots of different ways. We were raising issues. We were running to the head of the class. We had an amazing group of people in that class who were the women just kind of pushed all the guys out of the way. The faculty wasn't too keen on that. Some of them were very welcoming and understood what they were doing, but most of them either couldn't care less or were going to stand in the way.
Did you have any female professors?
No, Judy Arena arrived before I left, but other than that, there was one woman on the faculty that I know of, and I think she had been the librarian for some time. Pretty sure that's right.
So most your faculty was male.
Entirely.
Yeah. And
All the ones I encountered.
yes.
Yeah.
And what was the response from the men in the class
Um,
about all these women running around and taking up their space and asking all the questions?
Yeah.
And
I don't think I heard a lot of feedback from the men. They did not elect us to any positions of leadership that they could avoid electing us to, including most of the positions on the law review. I was a case and notes editor, but the editor-in-chief was a guy my year and the year after.
And so, what was the criteria to get on? I mean, was it just grading on then, or
you
so it was
graded
grading on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But once you graded on, then
you wrote an article.
and you were elected or not elected, it sounded like they didn't want. Okay.
I don't think so. The clinics were there in their beginning forms. Bill Greenhall, you probably have heard of the criminal law clinic that he founded there, was still in charge. And some women had been very successful in prior years at that clinic and still were being successful in that clinic. I didn't find it to be a particularly welcoming place. I volunteered with the Public Defender Service during my first year as a volunteer investigator. And so a natural movement from there would have been into that clinic, and I just couldn't get my mind around dealing with Bill Greenhall and some of the other guys there. Mm-hmm. So I didn't give them much of a chance. They might have given me more of a chance, but I didn't give them much. And I was pretty busy with the law review by the beginning of second year.
Okay. So were you getting into the idea of law school now? I mean, you had sort of different ideas where you were going to go, but now that you were in law school, it was...
I was going to be a public interest lawyer, preferably a legal aid lawyer.
So still embracing the...
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then my now husband and I got married at the end of my first year. And I decided, even though I knew that feminists weren't supposed to do this, that I would change my name. And the reason for it was that my father was in practice in D.C. and my uncle was in practice in D.C. and they both defended landlords, and I was sure I was not going to be on that side of the house. And it would just be too confusing for my clients if they walked in and the other side was represented by my name too.
Right.
So I decided to take the other name,
okay.
which sort of draped me with this incredible degree of invisibility in the D.C. legal circle. Because up until then, is the first question I would be confronted with when I met anybody who was a professional with any connections to lawyers in Washington, or most professionals in Washington really at that time. It was a pretty small town back then. So are you Leon's, who was my father, or are you Philip's, who was my uncle? That was the question. My siblings and I all got that our whole lives until I got married. And then there was a drape. I never got asked that question again. It was like turn on, turn off. It was very interesting.
And how did you feel when that started happening?
It was fine until I didn't get interviews with people I should be getting interviews with, because they didn't know my name.
And you were a woman.
And that helped too. One of the famous litigators in town at the time sent me a letter saying, "We don't have a bathroom for women lawyers. I'm sorry, but we won't interview you." One of my faculty members said that he wouldn't send my resume to a particular judge I wanted to clerk for because they'd already sent one woman's resume and they didn't want to back him into a corner because they knew he'd hire Georgetown into hiring 2. So, this is pre-Title IX.
Right. But nonetheless, so now
I'm not excusing them.
Right,
I'm just saying that the legal liability wasn't
there.
there.
So did that anger you, or was that just kind of like, well, this is just how it works?
I spent probably the first 25 years of my legal career with my face crunched up like that. It was not a happy time.
Yeah.
It was not. I was angry most of the time.
Right. Because of all these little injustices?
There's lots of mini aggressions, lots of very overt aggressions, lots of inability to do what you know you can do and need to do and your clients need you to do too. That just, either you could do it because you're going to work 16 times harder, or you weren't going to do it at all.
Right. So let's kind of bump back to law school. So you're on law review, you graded on, so that's a nice feather in the law school cap.
Well, not the law school didn't take any pride in any of that.
Well, but the employers would, right?
Theoretically.
And you were thinking about going into practice, it sounds like. So
Right.
so the legal academy was not on your radar.
No, not a bit. Not a bit, actually,
Okay.
which is really funny, given that I spent almost my entire career here. No, I had no idea.
Right.
I did want to clerk, though.
Okay.
So I put my name into the clerkship rolls, and the faculty wasn't helping a whole lot. But I did manage to get interviews with a bunch of Lyndon Johnson's midnight appointees. So I got to meet William Wayne Justice down in Texas. I got to meet Robert Marriage in Virginia, a bunch of really cool people, none of whom hired me because, for one reason, William Wayne Justice hired the #1 graduate of the University of Texas that year who happened to be a black woman.
Mm.
Great, terrific, you go
Yeah,
for that.
yeah.
Fine. And then one day I wake up, and in the Washington Post, there is the announcement that Marvin Mandel had appointed Rita Davidson to the Court of Special Appeals. First woman ever to sit in an appellate bench in the state of Maryland. It was the Intermediate State Court of Appeals. Georgetown doesn't send clerks to the Intermediate State Courts of Appeals. That just doesn't happen. I was going there.
Mm-hmm.
So I called her immediately and said, "Are you accepting clerkship applications?" And she said yes, and I got it to her that night.
Mm.
We interviewed the next day in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and I got hired that night.
Excellent.
This was in the latter part of my third year, first semester. She
Okay.
needed somebody to start the 1st of January. So I finished law school at night so that I could start
Wow.
the 1st of January. I was with her for a year and a half.
So before we get to that experience, I want to jump back a little bit. So we got all these, as we talked about, little aggressions, overt aggressions, whatever. There's the part of you being a female in this time, but you were also married by the time you were finishing law school. And was one, if you will, worse than the other, or was it a combination of being a married woman do you think that the marriage part had any effect on job searching and how people viewed you as a law student and soon-to-be lawyer?
I was probably oblivious to most of that. The best thing from the law school student perspective of the fact that I was married is that my husband was and remains an amazing cook. And so my study group would always meet at our place. And one day they all walked in. He had just made a turkey that, given our financial situation, we were going to eat it all week.
Mm-hmm.
It was gone before the study group left that night because everybody had just been sitting there picking off pieces of turkey. And to this day, whenever I run into anybody from that study group, they remember Dana's turkey.
Ah, okay. All right.
But I don't know that being married made any difference. Being pregnant a couple of years later made a huge difference, but not, I don't think, I don't
Okay.
know, but I don't think the marriage part did.
So you're clerking.
Right.
You clerked for 18 months with this female judge in Maryland, which was a groundbreaking thing
Yeah.
for her,
Yeah.
and then for you. And so what did you do after that? What did you think you'd do, and what did you end up doing? And then where's the pregnancy in all of that?
Well, the clerkship was amazing. Just one of the most brilliant women I've ever met. Unfortunately, no longer with us. Later joined the Court of Appeals of Maryland. And we're on this diddly little intermediate state court of appeals, and she's writing published opinions that everybody's quoting from that court. Mm-hmm. Quite incredible stuff. So she was an amazing person to work for, and that's when I really became a lawyer, was working for Judge Davidson. The judge knew what it meant to be. She would always say to me, "The problem with this appeal is they didn't plan it before they filed the case."
Mm.
And that was the lesson that you take from a good clerkship, is you don't file that case until you know what the appeal's going to look like. Because you need to know where the strengths and the weaknesses are. You need to plan it out. I mean, you teach in that area.
Yeah.
You know what that means.
Yeah.
So that was an incredible experience. She always called me her daughter-in-law. And she was very much my parent-in-law. She taught me so much. So then after that, I didn't have a job right away. But I had been taking these evening courses, some of them at American University because it was closer to where I was living. Mm-hmm. And I met the placement officer there who decided that she would help me even though I wasn't her student. Mm-hmm. She introduced me to Elliot Milstein, who was the director of their clinic and looking for a clinical supervisor, and he hired me. So I had never been in a courtroom on my own. Mm-hmm. Did traffic tickets for myself, but that was it. I'd never been in a clinical program. had never taught. And Elliot says, don't worry about any of that, we'll take care of it. And we did. We had an amazing year. About a week into it, I got pregnant.
So, and you tell me what you liked about that job.
Gosh, there was so much. Mostly it was brand new experiences.
Yeah.
But a lot of it was trying to get over my fear of all those brand new experiences while you're representing clients who are, this was a criminal defense clinic. They don't have anybody else they're able to do anything for them. The students, quite rightly, tested me a lot.
You're not much older than they are.
Younger than some, actually, at that point. But they were all very generous about it. And I think overall it was a pretty outstanding year for me in terms of my learning. Hopefully for this, a couple of them have told me in later years that, yeah, they learned a lot from me anyway. They were generous, but realistic. And then about 3 months into it, I said to Elliot, is this a one-year gig or, because now I'm pregnant, am I coming back in the fall? And he said, I want you to come back, but it's a one-year gig, so let's figure out how we're going to persuade the dean of that. And he said, you have to go to the AALS meat market, get another few offers, and then I know I can get my dean to do it. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I go to the meat market, which was actually here in this hotel, in my navy blue suit and my white blouse, skirt suit.
Yeah.
And
with probably a little bow tie.
That one didn't have a bow tie, but my maternity wear did, which was coming soon after that.
Yeah.
And this was, I think, early November, and I got offers from University of Kansas and University of Hawaii. It was pretty cool. And I fell in love with Hawaii. It was really impulsive and dumb, and I accepted it. And I ended up there with a 6-week-old baby.
Wow. And but also a husband who moved?
Oh yeah, under great protest.
But Hawaii.
Yeah, I know. That's what he said later, 2 years later, when I said, I can't get out of here. He said, but we're in Hawaii.
Yeah. So, but he moved.
He did.
And this was what years are we?
75.
Wow.
Daughter was born in July.
Okay.
And I was teaching in August.
And when you interviewed here, you were pregnant, but not
showing.
Not showing. Did the question come up at all?
No.
And what?
Until I raised it after they'd given me the offer.
And then how?
It was a almost brand new law school. Mm-hmm. It was, when I arrived, we were in the third year of the law school. It was staffed by people who considered themselves extremely liberal, wonderful people in every regard, some of which was true. And they were not about to show any discrimination against me on the basis of pregnancy or childbirth or any of that. Because by this time we're in the 70s, right? Mm-hmm. Betty Friedan was there already, and Title IX had been passed, and so they knew they couldn't go too far. And I think they were ideologically committed to integration and equality. I don't want to doubt that at all. They had no clue how to do any of it. Mm-hmm. Neither did I. Mm-hmm. So we made a bit of a hash of it, but it wasn't for bad intentions.
Right. So, but you had mentioned that being married didn't seem to affect things, but pregnancy did. So how did pregnancy?
Well, not pregnancy, having
a child, being now a mother.
Being now a mother, lots of different ways. One was it kind of reinforced when I was at Hawaii that I was the only woman on the faculty. They'd already had one woman who had come and gone. After me, there were several more who came and went. They couldn't figure out how to keep a woman on the faculty because they couldn't figure out anything about what that meant. And being the youngest person on the faculty as well by well over a dozen years and the only one with a young child, that completely, they couldn't figure out any of it.
So what your husband was working, he was a teacher?
Here at American University.
Okay.
Didn't work once we were out there. He lived on unemployment for the first year. He was going to write the great American novel.
Okay.
He did a lot of writing. He got an award for his poetry, but never made a career of it.
Okay, so was he able to be the primary caregiver at the
We
time?
actually ended up hiring somebody, which when I look back on it, and I think when he looks back on it, was not something we should have done. But we were trying to preserve his opportunity to become a writer.
Right. But that also should have freed you up, right?
I had a lot of time to be at the campus.
Right.
But being a law professor, particularly in your first few years when you're just learning the courses, is not a 10-hour a day or 8-hour a day, even 15-hour a day.
Right.
I felt like I was working all the time.
Yes. So.
And I was.
Yeah.
All the time, except when I was nursing her or we went to the zoo. That was pretty much what we did.
So what did you practice? So you interviewed here with having less than a year of being a clinical person under your belt.
Right.
So when you got hired as a faculty member, tenure track?
Right.
So what did you teach?
The first course, I'm pretty sure, was administrative law, and the second one was supervising the legal writing program. So first semester, if I remember this all correctly, I was teaching administrative law, which I had loved in school.
Right. Was that your choice or their?
I think it was a kind of a negotiation, and we both kind of came there. They wanted me to do family law, which was one of the things that kind of, because I had never taken it.
Yeah.
I said, oh, sure, administrative law. I love that in law school. No clue how hard that was to teach. Not a clue. So one of my favorite...
And that was before the Chevron two-step.
Yeah, exactly. We walk into the first day of class, there's 30 students out there. Literally more than half of them are older than I am because this is Hawaii. In the late 70s, there had never been a law school on the island. There was this huge pent-up desire for legal education. There were 75 students in each class. So this group was probably 40 students at most doing this upper-level elective. And so all the first cases are about delegation doctrine. To know the delegation doctrine, you have to understand that there are 3 branches of government. So I go home that night and say to my husband, the craziest thing happened in class today. I was talking about delegation and I suddenly realized I'm talking to a blank slate and we had to go back to basic organization of government. Like they didn't know there were 3 branches of government. And he looked at me, the English major that he was, and he said, there are? I knew I was in for a really hard semester at that point.
Yeah.
It was a really hard semester.
Yeah, so you taught that and supervised the legal writing program, probably all adjuncts.
No, it was a lot of faculty members, but I wrote all the problems and all the rubrics and all that kind of stuff. Did
you get chosen for that because you were
a woman?
The woman.
I'm pretty sure that was the only real consideration.
Yeah.
And then
coming from the legal writing background, I just figured that was the reason why.
You got it.
Yeah.
And then when, it didn't go absolutely perfectly because it couldn't the first time, I got no guidance on how to do it better because none of them had ever done it. Mm-hmm. They were all guys.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So then what did you do?
I lasted another year. It was a highly politicized environment, and a lot of the most traditional members of the bar did not think it was wise that there was any woman on the faculty. I was also the, second or third woman admitted to the state bar. There was already a woman who was a judge, but there weren't any other women practicing law. So we got a lot of grief for just having me on the faculty, for sending me off to the AALS where I was interviewing candidates because that was clearly inappropriate for somebody my sex and my age. It was harsh. It was a harsh time. And I lasted fall semester, the second year, announced toward the end of that semester to my family and to my dean I was gone. Mm-hmm. So by the end of that year, I was back in D.C. looking for work.
So you decided to leave without really having a plan of where to go. So
it was that bad.
Wow. You weren't sure about academics and legal academic.
I was sure I did not want to be an academic at that point.
Okay.
There was no way.
Okay. So the family's back here in D.C. and then I did see you did do some. I was going to say private practice, but it's not. But you did some lawyering.
At the Justice Department.
Right. Public sector lawyering. So that was the opportunity that popped up then?
Um,
Or were you looking for that particular
I
one?
was looking for something non-academic, so I had opportunities at a law firm that did union work, which would have been very interesting, I think, and this opportunity at the Justice Department during the Carter administration to come in as at the bureaucratic level, but doing Freedom of Information Act work. Now, just on administrative law, that was very attractive. The idea of making governance actually work, very exciting. And for a couple of years, we actually had a chance to do that. It was good work. And then the Reagan people arrived and tried to fire me, which they couldn't really do because I was a bureaucrat. That frustrated them. So they gave me a little bit of time to go find another job, but get out of the Justice Department.
Because?
Because they wanted the Freedom of Information Act to be amended by Congress to deny people access to information. And I said, well, you know, the act's working pretty well. Even the FBI kind of likes it. Why do we need to amend it? And they said, because we shouldn't be allowing people so much access to information. And what's wrong with doing that? You know, it's a democracy. I was introduced very early in 1981 to what we are now seeing a lot more of, about the anti-democratic values of the Republican Party.
I'm trying to figure out how to ask did you want to leave, or there just wasn't a choice to leave?
There was no choice.
Okay.
I was out of there. And so I applied several other places in government, got a job actually at the State Department doing contract negotiations for the State Department, all those places where we have embassies and there are contracts associated with all of them. It's all kind of interesting property stuff. But then my clearance got backed up because we were embargoing anything related to Iran at that moment, and all of those lawyers took precedence over my background check because obviously I was just going to do contract work.
Yeah.
And so by the time that was all over, I had found a job at Maryland. And
Okay,
I left and went there.
right. So you're back in academia.
Yeah.
And did you welcome that?
Well, it was a clinical program, so
Okay.
that was very attractive. I actually had options at AU and at Maryland at that moment, and I thought, you know, if I can do clinical work, practice with students, get back into my legal aid roots, this is going to be good. I'm going to really like this. And most of the time I really have, until I left that a few years, now more than a few years ago, I really did like practicing with students.
So by now that so now we're into like 1983. So there's been, the Title IX and more women into law schools than there was even in your class, and hopefully more women on faculties.
Yes,
albeit
a few.
Probably in the clinical, legal writing clinical and.
And we were starting to get quite a few at Maryland on the tenure track as well.
Okay, so
mostly because we were pushing hard to do that.
So as a clinical professor, there were other women professors around you, so you had more of a network, I imagine.
Only because we worked hard to create it. We worked hard to create a reading group
Yep.
that included 3 of us from Maryland, a couple people from American, from GW, George Mason, and we all started meeting on a regular basis. That led into the creation eventually of a regional group of law professors.
Right.
The Maryland, D.C., Virginia women law professors, and we started trying to educate each other about how do you succeed in this kind of bizarre occupation that we're in.
Right. So were you, as a clinical professor, were you tenure track?
Yeah, I was.
Okay, so you were at that time. Okay.
Not because my dean particularly wanted it, but because I said, if you want me, that's the condition. And we fought about it for a year, and eventually he caved.
Okay. Wow. That's
yeah.
Great negotiation.
Yeah, but then he decided not to grant me tenure, so we had to deal with that for another year, and then there was the promotion, and we had to deal with that. I mean, he caused a lot of angry moments.
So was that was that more? Is that like? Do you think that was a gender issue or just a particular?
Pretty easily identified as a gender issue because the other clinical person who got hired the same year as me, with a less accomplished resume, was on the tenure track. Happened to be male.
Without any issues.
I mean, he did go to Yale, I went to Georgetown, but they're both pretty fancy.
I was just saying, I don't, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I'm not
thought
seeing
so.
much of a difference, no offense to
me either.
Yale.
No.
But yeah, okay, so then there was that issue, but you enjoyed what you were doing, and you were doing clinical work, working with students, and you were seeing more women coming through?
The women at Maryland, I think it was true all over the country, but I only got to see it at Maryland. In the mid-'80s, there were a lot of women who had wanted to go to law school for a long time and hadn't done it. And they took advantage of every law school they could in the 80s. And so we had this amazing group of women who, had waited until their families were grown or partially grown and then dove in. So they were an amazing group. We had that group. And then toward the end of the 80s, I was kind of happy to see, this year we have a lot of average women. Finally.
Yeah.
That's great.
So was the environment, did you feel the environment for the female students was better than it had been when you were a student?
Clearly so.
Okay.
There was still real issues with harassment by faculty members. Not as much that I heard about of harassment by other students. There was also a lot of inappropriate stuff in classrooms, like around rape issues, around unconscionability questions, all of the kinds of cases that women law professors, Mary Jo Frug and the whole gang of us were writing about. Mm-hmm. They were all coming up in our classrooms and in the students' classrooms, and they were beginning to understand that it was going to take a lot of years for a lot of women pushing really hard to make law change. Mm-hmm. And they were just beginning to really get that. So we did the Gender Bias in the Courts report at the end of that decade in Maryland. I was one of the reporters. One of my students actually became my co-reporter on the project. Mm-hmm. And so we learned a lot about how the courts were operational, and we used that study for years in classrooms afterwards to open the eyes of students, both male and female,
right,
about what was going on.
Right. So then you did at some point move over to where you are now, right?
Right, the classroom side.
Yeah, so tell me about that switch.
Well, over the course of my years in the clinic, I had done work on family violence issues, a lot of different, we kind of had an all-purpose clinic around family violence issues. Then I had done some landlord-tenant work, and then in '94 I went to South Africa on a Fulbright, and I met the Speaker of the House, a woman named Frincis, and she said, "You're here thinking that gender's the big deal," and it is, but poverty is really the big deal. And when I came home, we were in the middle of welfare reform, and we created a new clinic to address welfare reform, which was very exciting collaboration with a small boutique public interest firm in town. And when that finally came to an end 5 years later, because my collaborator found a new job and left town, I decided I don't want to do clinic anymore by myself.
Yeah.
I want to do a collaboration, and I never found a collaboration as rich as that again.
No.
So that propelled me more and more into classroom work.
Okay.
And then on top of that, my daughter had some illness issues, and I had some illness issues, and so classroom was just a lot easier to deal with than clinics, because clinics, you're litigating, you're on tap,
Right.
or you're doing legislative advocacy, or you're doing administrative advocacy, you're doing advocacy work, you're on top all the time. Mm-hmm. And I just didn't have the real access to good work in the right environment at that moment.
So
now I teach property. Family law, which became my specialty area before that, actually.
Yeah. And these were these areas that you were interested in, or was again sort of a
property was just we need a first-year person, and I've become very interested in it since.
Right.
Family law I had become very interested in because of the family violence work. Mm-hmm. But the other thing I do now grew out of the poverty and welfare work, which is work on families that raise disabled children. Mm-hmm. Because what we found during welfare reform is that the women who were the most vulnerable to deep poverty were the ones who had disabled family members. Mm-hmm. And so I've done a lot of work in that, and that's now taken me into special education, contracts, which I'd never done anything about before, and tort damages. I'm working on a tax article right now.
Not where
Very
you
bizarre.
not where you thought you'd go.
Not where I thought I'd go.
But I've read your piece from 2012 about 1992, the Year of the Woman, which of course probably speaking to the choir when I sort of summarize this, but 1991, Anita Hill testifies, and the treatment of her and that whole issue just enraged a whole group of women.
Mostly women.
Yeah, and repeated again with the Kavanaugh hearings, but that in 1992, so many more women were getting elected to office. And you mentioned how that Anita Hill hearing also motivated you. And at the time, it was that you were chairperson of
Right.
the section on women in legal education.
Right.
So been around this section for a while. And you presented Professor Hill with an award.
We did.
And you talked about in that article, I'm sure you remember the bravery that she inspired, and could you talk a little bit about how that worked for you internally, how that motivated you to some of the things you talked about South Africa a little bit already,
Right.
but
Yeah, it was in that same year, and I'm sure inspired by that experience, that I applied for the Fulbright. Now, at that point, I had a 5-year-old child at home. I had another child who was about to leave for college. There are 12 years between my two only children. And my parents gave birth to all 4 of us relatively late in life. My mom was almost 40 when my younger brother was born. So, elderly parents. But I decided, if I'm going to go to South Africa, there's a Fulbright on offer right now in Durban. I can apply. I can do this. Somehow we will figure out a way. Mm-hmm. And so I applied, and the same year I applied to be dean of a few law schools, actually, and got pretty far along in that process as well, and backed out eventually because I'd become a finalist for the Fulbright. And that turned out to be, career-wise, the perfect choice. I could never have been a decent dean, but it was very helpful to have that inspiration that it's time to move on, it's time to move into something new. And that 6 months I got to spend in South Africa, it was the year of the transformation. It was the year apartheid was turned over to Mandela, and the new government and new people were bursting out of the woodwork. My most incredible opportunity there was to work on how the new Constitution, which was going to be written after the transition, should respond to women's needs. And so this group I was working with was working in rural communities. We made up all kinds of hypotheticals, and then we'd go out to these rural communities and talk to women in these villages who only spoke mostly Zulu or something similar to Zulu about what they wanted to see in the Constitution. And at one of these locations, there were 2 garden plots, commercial garden plots, one of which was growing gigantic cabbages, and the other was growing normal-sized cabbages. And we asked, well, what's the difference? And they said, well, the American Embassy gave us some money to put a water tap over here. For that one, we still have to go to the river to bring the water up. So it's not as flourishing. And I knew that the American Embassy had had that program for at least a decade. Mm-hmm. So I said, so why now? Why did you just get that? Because now, even under the transitional Constitution, women are in the Constitution. We mean something. And I was like, those are just words. What are you talking about? I could not understand that. I really couldn't. But if I hadn't been in South Africa, I would have never even had the chance to think about it.
Right. And that's what struck me from your article, that for those women on the ground, if you will,
Yes.
so far removed.
Very much on the ground.
Yes, and so far removed from government and law and everything, that the symbolic, the importance of being included meant that they had the power to actually do something. They could ask the government for that money. Right?
But they're never removed. They know much better than you and I would ever know what law means in their daily life. They were in a village of childbearing age women, children, and old people. Why? Because the way the law worked in the mines meant they couldn't accompany their husbands to the mines. They couldn't get work in the locations where the mines were. So the husbands come home every year for a month, bring whatever diseases, including HIV, they had happened to pick up while they were there because they're so incredibly lonely for the year. And then they come back, and the law says, now you're going to be vulnerable to whatever these husbands are doing while they're home. They know that.
Yeah.
They are never separated from law.
Right.
They know they don't have electric in their villages when the White House next door has it because of law. And law is one of the big themes in South Africa, in South African life, even now.
Right.
But back then it was even more because it was law that made apartheid work.
Right. Right. And that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And but your paper also incorporated these themes of collaboration and sort of collaboration is clearly not only a feminist idea, but I think of it in terms of some ways as a feminist idea, and just the idea of doing what inspires you, what choices you make to be true to you and to be brave about it. I thought was a really very powerful message, and I'm wondering if, as you've gone through your career and you've written so much and you've done so much in terms of feminist work and advocating for women, has it ever been a problem, a barrier, something that has held you back in any way?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. The reason that the dean and I fought so much about tenure, in part, was I had spent a couple of years working on the gender bias report, which was all for the good and glory of the law school, of course, at that point, in the late 80s. But as far as he was concerned, was not an academic contribution to anything about anything.
Right. So here we're at from the legal writing standpoint, what counts as scholarship? What counts as something that's going to go well for you for tenure, and what isn't?
Right, exactly.
And that sounds like that fits
one of
right
those
in there.
early meetings we had at the regional group, one of the early training meetings we had to help other women learn what it meant to be a law professor. Wendy Williams, who I guess she's now retired from, probably is retired now from Georgetown, she talked about how do you pick what you write about? And she said you pick what you're going to write about because it's got to keep you going until you finish it, and that's always a haul. So don't let them talk you out of writing about something that is meaningful to you. She was the only person in the whole room who was giving that advice. Everybody else was giving the standard advice, which was write something that will help get you tenure.
And then write about whatever you would.
Then write about.
Right.
Which is still the standard advice. I'm not sure it's bad advice, but I'm really glad we had a chance to give both.
Right. Right. So, and you've had a couple of visitorships, but you're obviously, firmly entrenched in legal academia now. Are you have a daughter? Is it another daughter or two?
You want to see pictures? Happen to have.
Sure. I was going to ask, have they followed in the law?
No, I have one in business and one in marine sciences of the two birth kids. My son-in-law is an educator, but not in law.
Okay.
And we happened to get together just in March for my grandson's bar mitzvah. So that's the whole crowd.
Made a book of it. That is
sister and brother-in-law and brother and sister-in-law and my daughter. But I wanted to show you the one.
Can we show?
Yeah.
The family picture? Can we?
Yeah. Let me just. The one with everybody?
Yeah, just kind of turn that around.
This is the entire
Washington
crew descendant crew. Just a few missing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Most everybody. And that's the bar mitzvah, my grandson, right in the front.
Right.
And then, let's see if I can find it real fast. Yes.
There.
This is
beautiful
my
picture.
grandson. That's me.
Yes.
Same jacket.
Yep.
My husband of almost 50 years, my daughter, and her husband, Jake. And this one over here is my son, who's just returned from Antarctica.
Oh my goodness. That's your son right there?
That's my son with
okay.
his devoted nephew.
Oh my gosh.
And that's the two of us with my grandson.
Oh, wonderful.
So, yeah.
So he's obviously from Antarctica. He's
He's studying marine, it's kind of a marine biology at Stanford. He's taking his PhD right now.
Oh.
And my daughter is just finishing her business master's in business, executive master at Georgia State, and she'll be spending a chunk of January in South Africa for their internship.
Did she choose that because of Mom?
She was there while I was there, and then she went back during college to do some research for her honors certificate. And since then, she's done a lot of other things. She owned a horse farm. She's been in medical, pharmaceutical sales and both retail and in a hospital. And now she's in a leadership role in her business as well. And now she's taking her degree. And my son-in-law took his PhD in Charlottesville a few years ago. He does educational technology transfer. So I get to learn all kinds of stuff about Blackboard from him.
Which is very, very important
helpful.
skill.
Very
yes.
helpful, yeah.
So I want to just, as works, I kind of feel like we're kind of winding down here. Do you, over the course of your career, from law school and then in the professional career, there are lots of changes, right, in the legal profession and with women in it. What advice would you give a starting female law professor now?
Very good question. Reach out to as many colleagues as you can make connections with.
Men and women?
Men and women, in your institution, out of your institution. But if you are not also a lawyer, in practice, doing some kind of lawyering, and I define lawyering extremely broadly, then think about whether you're doing for your students everything that you can. Could you do some advocacy work? Could you do some research that's related to some social need? One of the key experiences for me was when I was very active on the board of SALT. And in the couple of years around that time, I sensed in many of my colleagues a real aversion to electoral politics after a time when I'd gotten very deeply involved in electoral politics. That worries me. It seems to me that that may be blocking off an opportunity for learning about issues that the public might be interested in and that you as lawyers might be able to advance. I've learned a lot about lawyering through my electoral politics work. And not just the obvious stuff of doing voter protection, which I've done, but also what issues do people really want you to think about and why, and how can you work them into an agenda that makes sense with other things. So I really think lawyers, we're training lawyers. We are not graduate schools. We are professional schools. And I say that proudly. We should be having more evening schools settings. We should be having more advocacy opportunities for students, but we're not going to do that if we're not doing it ourselves. And so get your head out of the books once in a while, or find things that you can write articles about that are also important to people out there. Don't just write about things
To the echo chamber.
to the echo chamber, exactly. And that's going to make you a better teacher. It's going to make you a better scholar. And then the other thing that's made me, I think, a much better teacher than I ever was as a younger person is learning how to ride a horse. So the other piece of advice I would give you is find something really hard to learn because it will make you much more empathic with your students.
I was trying to learn to knit, and I had that epiphany. It was like, I hate this frustrated around. And then it just reminded me, well, that's probably how they feel.
Exactly how they feel.
Because to me, I've done that and done what they're doing now. I've done it for a long time.
Yeah,
it's easy.
Exactly. But once you finish the sweater, it will make you really happy.
Right.
I rode my first recognized test as a dressage rider, which is a huge big deal, in September. 72 years old on a 21-year-old horse. I flubbed most of the test, but everybody gave me a round of applause afterwards because I was doing it for the very
First time. Yep.
And it was so hard to get there. Just incredibly hard to
Well,
get there.
congratulations.
Thank you. I didn't bring the ribbon.